Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. We are here with another interview with a great storyteller, and today my guest is Stuart Rothgiesser, the anthropologist, narrative expert, my colleague among the storytelling and organizations board members, and the founder of ROTH. It's a full-service consultancy that specializes in development and sustainability communications. Stuart is a pro in terms of storytelling, but we are today discussing a different topic, which is actually story collecting. And we will get to how it's going. But first, Stuart, it's a great pleasure to see you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Artem. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. I know quite a lot about you. I've watched your shows and we've been on the board for some time, but can you tell me, and my audience, of course, your story? Like, how did you end up in storytelling in your as a profession?
Sure. So I come from a teaching background. I was a teacher of English and social studies for 8 years. And then I was looking for a change. One day I looked at a history teacher who was close to retirement, and I saw him just scrolling through a folder and teaching the same lesson that he taught probably 20 times. And I realized that I had to make a decision. Either I would stay in teaching until retirement, or I would go and grow my skills. And because I was teaching research skills and writing skills and interviewing, I felt a little bit like a fake because I'd gone straight from university into teaching and I hadn't really experienced that. So I thought, let me make the decision, even though I love teaching and I still have a passion for it, let me go and grow my skills. And I registered for a master's in social anthropology at the University of Cape Town. This was in 2004. And my main interest was to try and understand people, was to understand human relations, which anthropology does. But a couple of years later, this festival came to South Africa. It's called Africa Burns. And it's actually the younger cousin of Burning Man in America. And the whole idea behind this is that all the participants have to bring they have to participate. They have to bring some kind of artistic skill. They have to build something. They have to, people make incredible sculptures based on the themes of the year. And I thought my contribution was I was going to go and collect stories. And people said to me, oh, this is crazy. You're not doing anything. But I met someone else who had a similarly crazy idea. And he said, that's great. So we ran out and we bought these Muslim robes and we bought a digital recorder and we made a sign that said, share your story. And off we went to this festival. There were about 2,000 people. It's since grown to, I think, 12,000 people. And it's in the desert about 2.5 hours north of Cape Town. And so it's very rugged terrain. So we were wearing these robes. We had our recorder and our sign that said, share your story. And we go around and everyone's camping. So imagine tents all over the place in a big semicircle. There's caravans and these artistic shows. People even build telephone booths, big desert tents where people are hanging out, playing music, etc. So it's a massive party for about a week. And we'd go around to these different places and we'd say, hey, tell us your story. And from doing this I think we did it for about 3 days, we learned a lot. The first thing is that some people said to us, well, why should we tell you our story? You tell us your story first. And so we realized that we have to actually first expose ourselves, become vulnerable in order for people to open up to us. So we quickly changed the sign from share your story to share a story. We also realized that people wanted to share their stories. There were people there amongst all these tens of thousands of people that were actually quite lonely as well. So we've got stories about conversion, stories of love. We've got stories of local indigenous mythology. And people also told us stories just about their lives. So we got stories of people that had car accidents on the way up to this very remote, rocky place. And we became almost news bearers around this camp. So we'd say, oh yeah, we heard about these guys that had an accident. Why don't you go speak to those people? And as we traipsed around, because we literally would walk around for hours, And we started holding all the sort of stories of this huge festival. So we realized that we were onto something here. People really liked the idea. We had lots of material. And we decided, let's try and use new media. So let's try and put this in digital format. So we came back to Cape Town and we built a website called shareastory.net. It no longer exists, but we did manage.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
it's a pity, but we did actually manage to program it so that you could, using the computer microphone, you could upload a story, an oral story, you could add photographs, you could tag it, share it, use social media. This was back in 2008, so technology has advanced a lot since then. And we also started doing story courses ourselves. So I did a course at the School of Storytelling out of Sussex around storytelling. But our main mission was to use stories as a way to continue to transmit ancient knowledge. And storytelling, whether it's on the African continent, in India, China, it's always been part of old civilizations. And we felt that there's a lack of transmission of this knowledge, and we wanted to share it between the older generations and the younger generations. And so this became my entry into the world of story. But after having done the short course of storytelling, to take different techniques of storytelling, I realized that I'm not the performer. I'm much more geared towards being the listener, being the story collector. And so I started to explore how could I become better at story collecting. And obviously doing my anthropology studies, I had to do interviews and one-on-one. And I started to realize that I could actually make this into a process. I could learn how to build rapport, build trust, body language. And then I started embedding it into my communications work.
Mm-hmm.
So while studying, I started going back to one of my first loves, which was writing. And I started wondering, how could I mix story work, communications, and social science research? And so I started using story collecting and storytelling in focus groups in the corporate sector, which worked really, really well.
Oh.
So yeah, embedding fictional stories around purpose in employee engagement focus groups. And 50-year-old men who very conservative, actually resonating with us and beginning to open up and telling us what really matters. Or using storytelling to collect employee stories and then creating content like videos from that. It was really authentic. We did a series of podcasts where we went up the West Coast and we collected people's stories, why they love the place they work in, why the province was a good place for them to do business. And so started experimenting with different productions. And so now we've become known as the communications company that knows how to collect stories and use it to create content for research purposes, etc. And we're constantly growing. So right now we're working on radio shows and how to embed stories in radio shows. And so it's been an interesting journey along the way.
Wow. I feel the warmth of the fires burning in the festival that you've talked about. Thank you so much. What I loved about your story is that the first part, you really skipped to the part with the festival, and it was so contentful, so much details about this. Share your story to share a story. Wow. And actually, when you were finishing the telling, I was thinking to myself, well, I need to Google shareastory.net to see if it's still there, and I will definitely check after we end this interview. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful story. Stuart, I've been thinking about the question because you said you're rather not a storyteller, but a story collector. And that's something I truly associate myself with too. And my question would be this: there are some competencies of a storyteller, like, to make a connection with the audience, which is obviously something a story collector needs to do. But I guess there are some competencies in storytellers' life which are, opposing the story collection. So maybe there are some that you can think of right now, then share, that are, different competencies.
Yeah, I think storytellers, the focus is very much on performance. So it's on the storyteller themselves, How do they use their voice, their body language? How do they occupy the stage? The story is actually not that important. So I've seen, using the same story, but storytellers, 5 different storytellers tell it 5 different ways. The story collection, the focus is clearly on the person who's telling the story. And the smaller you can make yourself as story collector, the better. Often, we've collected stories from farm workers, from industrial workers, people that would never be able to afford to go to a psychologist and pay whatever, $100 an hour. And this is a real gift, that there's someone coming, and it's not just me, it's a team of 2 or 3 that are spending 3 hours sitting in their home and just purely focused on them, listening to them. This is an amazing gift. It shows a real humility. So I think humility is one thing that a story collector needs to have. I think another thing is keen observation skills. So we often try and collect stories in people's houses, so we can see the family photographs, we can see the trophies, the medals, and therefore their hobbies and interests. So I think you need to have a natural curiosity, and that's the tie-in that I found with anthropology. I'm really interested in how people relate to each other, what motivates them. I'm not a psychologist, but often we kind of fall into that role. And one has to be careful, because people will start to open up to you and tell you, and we have people cry and laugh, tell us very deep secrets, family issues, but we don't want to move into that role of being a psychologist. So we always have to, in the back of our minds, and maybe this is another talent of a story collector, is to be able to always be looking at the big story while at the same time being engaged with the person. I can't let myself get too emotionally engaged, otherwise I'll lose being able to mold the story. I always have to be able to direct them along the path, keep the story going so I can transcribe it. So I think humility, curiosity, and being able to have to maintain a certain objectivity or distance is key for story collector. And I think most of us are quiet people. Storytellers are much more, they're artists, performers, right? They're loud and they're big movements. We're very quiet, small. We don't want to be the center of attention. I think that's a key difference.
Wow, that's good. And even though the quietness, it still helps a storyteller, because I saw a girl, a friend of mine from the school, and she had a very, very soft and very, very quiet voice. And whenever she started answering in the lesson, everybody went silent, because she wasn't heard unless everybody went silent. And I think that story collecting is, in a way, it's somehow deeper than storytelling. But here's another question for you. If it's like it is a different art, a different set of skills, but I feel that story collecting can help you become a better storyteller, obviously. But let me put it in a different way. Not how, but maybe you saw one of your skills that you've developed on your journey as a story collector that really helped you, and you felt that it helped you become a better storyteller somehow.
I think, I mean, we also, we learn to identify what makes for a good story, because I can't sit with someone and they just tell me an anecdote or a tale.
Yeah, right.
I need to actually deliver a story. So we need to learn the story arc. We need to learn the hero's journey. And when we teach story collecting, we always mostly teach the hero's journey, because it's the easiest thing. So when I'm collecting stories, I'm listening for, where was the conflict? Where was the call to action? What were the learnings? Who were the mentors, the allies, the villains? And then we then actually, after our conversation, we kind of find that that's the story, and then we go back and we ask them to retell it, but according to that rubric. So otherwise, you have 3 hours of recording and there's nothing there. So the first part is just exploration, getting to know the person and helping them feel comfortable until we actually identify a proper story. So I think probably we're similar in that we both study story structure, and I understand what that is. The other thing is probably similarities. We both understand our audiences. So, we're sent out to collect a story for a particular client. And so we need to understand who's that audience, what kind of language do they like, and almost translate the story, the data, into something that they could digest. And one of the things on that note that's happened to us, which has been quite difficult, is we've collected stories for a certain medium. In one case, we collected stories for podcasts, and the client took the information, changed it, and made it into explainer videos that were quite humorous, and they weren't the right medium to deliver it. And that was a real sharp learning for us, because we also have a responsibility to the storytellers. You know, if I come and say to you, Artem, I'm collecting your story, it's going to be produced on radio for this audience, that's my responsibility. But if the client decides, let's make a TV series out of it, but it's not Artem, it's Tom in the USA, and they have a completely different context, it's still your story, which has now been moved into something else. And that's a very difficult position to be in between the client and the storyteller. Yeah, it's interesting that.
Yeah, it's a thing I never thought about. Well, it's an ethical thing. It's quite basic, but when you think about it, it's not that easy to manage. So yeah, thank you for noting.
It's an ethical thing, and it's because when you come to collect someone's story, and we're always collecting real life stories, so it's not fictional stories, then you're saying this is where your story is going to be used. This is the intention. But if the client takes that research and changes it completely, then do they still have the right to withdraw their story completely? What happens then between the client and the communications company who's contracted to collect so many stories? These are the issues. And often if you're speaking to people who are not that well versed in social media or in the web, they don't really understand the extent of how far their story can go. You're speaking to people that perhaps are living in rural areas and they don't have huge internet access. They won't understand things like podcasts. They won't understand webinars, yet their story is still moving somewhere. So one of the key things is anonymity, sure, but it's more than that. You actually have a responsibility to, with our knowledge of communications channels, we actually have a responsibility to share with the storyteller, this is where your story could go. And actually, sometimes we have to instruct them a little bit about the possibilities.
It's good. I like that we explored this issue a little bit, because it's really important to not just rip off the story from the teller, but to keep that connection. And here's an interesting point I'm thinking about right now. This process of collecting a story, it's there are a lot of technical things in it, but one I heard from you is that you extract the story and then you build it using the story structure, and then you ask the person to tell it again. And I actually had an occasion when we had a project for a big company. It had a new region and they needed to develop a mission of some sort or a purpose. And we used story collection from several of their employees. And some of them, I just recorded a call on the Zoom when they were telling stories, and I've cut the call on the Zoom. And it was fabulous. It was energetic. It was spirited. I know I wasted a lot of time to cut, but it was worth it. But with some of them, I made a different point of view. I made a Zoom call and then I rephrased the story and gave it to them to tell based on the structure. And it felt a bit lifeless. We did 3 or 4 trials and it went back to life and it was structured and it was strong. But like, can you explore with me somehow, like what's happening in this point when you give back the structure, and how to avoid this void of emotions, I would say, that it imposes?
So that's the production part. So for podcasts, for instance, we always have a narrator, and the narrator moves the story along, as well as putting in sound effects. So you can have the person sort of retell their story, and it would be lifeless if it was just that. But if you add in, so it needs a good production person, a good sound producer who has a studio, who has access to all the background sounds. And often if someone talks about a certain sound, for instance, I grew up by the river, then we go and we collect the sounds from the river, the water flowing, and that's added in. Or they talk about, I was working in a sewing factory, Then we can go and collect sounds of sewing machines. So all of those sounds add up a lot of interest to the story itself and take away the blandness.
That's a decision I would never supposed to be there, like a montage with the sounds, because it's
Yeah.
really immersive. Wow, thank you.
So that's the key difference between the work that we do and the work that PR agencies do. And PR agencies will say, okay, we need to tell a story, and they will get a 20-something hipster sitting in his air-conditioned office, and he will write up a story. And then they will go and film that particular story, and they'll know exactly where they're going to shoot it, which characters to use, etc., etc. And they will call that storytelling. What we will do is the exact opposite. We will go out and say, we think we have a story. The client will say, "Good, Artem's got a great story. He's a success story. He's built his own business, etc. Go and tell the story." Okay. So then we start doing research, and we meet with you, and we may find that you actually don't have a story. There's no great conflict. There's no hero's journey. We may find that you don't want to speak. You may find that you speak poorly. But if you pass all of those checks, then we'll sit with you, as I said, and we'll explore. And it takes at least 3 hours until we find a story that you have and that you're willing to tell. And then we will then only then do the visuals or the sounds accordingly. So you may, we spent 3 days with an employee, and she was telling us a story, and she told us how she moved to a house that no longer leaked. She used to live in an informal settlement where people were drinking, rain would come through the roof and fall on the children. So then we sent our camera crew to the settlement or to a similar one and got those images of beer bottles lying around, etc. But we can't predict our shoot days or even our schedule until we've collected the story first. Whereas most production houses will say, okay, we're going to shoot here, here, and here, 3 days, and that's it. We work the complete opposite. We let the story emerge first, and then we do the production afterwards. And that's very exciting. So that energy that you heard about when I was talking about the festival, that's the same energy that we go with. And people open up. People will agree to us. We don't need to get permission to shoot on locations. All of that stuff just kind of melts away because of the energy with which we come. And it's quite amazing. So for example, when we were shooting employee stories, she said, I want to be the first person in my family to drive a car. And I said, okay. And then we said, well, one of the things you must do as a story collector is probe a little bit deeper. So we said, well, what kind of car? No, a Toyota Yaris. A Toyota Yaris is the kind of Toyota model. It's a small 4-seater model, very reliable car, nothing fancy. So off we went to a Toyota dealership. And without speaking to the person, we walked in and said, can we shoot this lady? We're doing a video story, an employee story. Can we shoot her in a Yaris? Now, of course, she didn't have a driver's license, so she couldn't drive. But the sales assistant agreed, and again, didn't know us from anywhere, agreed he'll drive. She sat in the car, and we filmed her. And again, she opens the car, the new smell. You could see the amazement on her face. And then we filmed them driving out, and all of that was done spontaneously. It emerged from the story, and the energy with which we're coming, the joy of the exploration of engaging with someone else, just opens these doors, and it was amazing. So that's been our experience.
Wow,
in collecting stories.
That is so awesome. I can imagine the smile on her face when she saw that you are actually doing this. It's like, are we doing it? Wow.
Yeah, it's
Super
incredible.
Wow, that's an amazing
And
example.
the interesting thing about that is that she'd never been in this car before. So her dream, which she'd voiced to us, suddenly becomes a lot realer. Now she's sitting in the car, which she wants to purchase, right? And
Awesome.
and so the telling of a story can itself become a part of a healing, a part of a actually imagining your reality.
Yeah.
So the production process can be really interesting.
That's so awesome. Wow. And I had two ways that I wanted to go before this, like when you were answering the question, but when you started telling about this woman, I was like, oh my God, this is so nice. Oh yeah, interview. Yeah. So thank you so much. Actually,
Sure.
one way I was thinking about it is it sounds very human and very natural what you do. And for me, it's a bliss, honestly. But I feel that corporations are often not into this kind of stuff. And as you know, as someone who inspires people to tell stories, I find myself in, you know, a task to first explain where to use stories on the spot, and that helps me to propel the idea of storytelling and business forward. But on your side, like, how can you propel the idea of story collecting to the organizations so they are like, oh, now we get it, like now we get what's it for?
Well, storytelling is such a buzzword at the moment, that our problem, our challenge lies in the fact that people got the wrong idea about storytelling for communications, and that everyone with a camera has become suddenly a storyteller. So I wrote an article a few years ago about the difference between story collecting and storytelling, because most people don't know what story collecting really is. As I said, these are producers of hardcore news channels that suddenly think that they're journalists, that think that they're the worst people to try and tell stories, right? Because journalists have one angle. They want to get in there, get the facts, and get out. And what we do is we start with something small and we widen the net until we can find the story. So in our experience, as soon as we say that we work in storytelling, that opens a door already. But then there is that piece where we need to actually explain what we mean by that. And we found that we're very successful when it comes to teaching, training communications officers and program officers in identifying stories and collecting them and using it internally in their own communications products, whether it's writing stories about their programs. We're also successful using it in research because we can show that we get very deep insights from our methodology. So I think it's not a hard sell to get ourselves in the door, but we need to explain the process to the clients. We need them to have a little bit more patience and to go along with us for the journey. And when they do, they will see the great results. And then you've got a converted client that will stay with you, forever and come back for other needs, especially in research. It doesn't work if you want something quick, like quick market research. Then people would rather use surveys. We often, for example, we consulted to one of the big 4 consulting companies 2 years ago, and they said they were running storytelling focus groups in the banking industry. So we said, okay, and they wanted some help with facilitation. They didn't do any story telling or story collecting in these focus groups. They just called them that. And so, we had to, it wasn't our place, but we had to say to them, well, have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about embedding some design thinking into these workshops? And they hadn't. So I was quite surprised that this top tier management consulting firm was just, quite blasé about it. So I think, at first I used to get quite resentful about people saying it in the storytelling space. But I do believe that the more sort of talk there is about storytelling, the better, and the wheat will separate from the chaff. The best will rise to the top. The cream will rise to the top in this field, and I think that clients will understand from what they get from the insights, from the content they get. They'll understand which companies are really in the space, are really committed to the process, and which ones are just saying that they're part of the storytelling space.
That's quite realistic, and this is a great example. I also saw, like, when you said it, I immediately remembered this example of a company I've been working on, and they said, like, we have great storytelling, and it was like fact, date, fact, date, fact, date, and I was like, not quite, but we can get something out of it. And it was a great process afterwards. So and it's a good thing that storytelling is a buzzword in a way. So
I think
okay.
there's a lot of interest in the leadership space of using storytelling and how to communicate. So we've coached CEOs in extracting personal stories and then communicating them to 200 plus people, and they've had great responses. So I think that more and more, especially in that space, and we've used storytelling in values workshops, when you work at the exco level, the C-suite level, there's quite a lot of, I think the leadership is quite interested in storytelling, both using it to communicate downwards and using it to understand purpose, mission, vision, etc. So I think that that's a space that tying storytelling and facilitation is a really good space to work in.
Yeah, that's and leadership in a new kind of way, not in managerial or
Yeah.
situational or whatever there is about leadership. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Okay, Stuart, I was going to ask you this question up front, but we had such a lovely conversation so far, and there are some techniques you've explored on the conference back in January of 2020. And what I liked about it is that you've shown a masterclass. So for anyone watching this, go on and watch the recording of this Stuart's talk that he did with his partner. And that was amazing. But you've explored several techniques like, open heart and rapport. But here's the question. Give me one technique that is either unobvious, like something out of the blue, like, oh, I need to do this to get better at collecting stories, or something that you cannot just and go for it, like active listening. You can intern the active listening and you're already in it, but there's something you need to develop over time. So either one or both for you to choose.
So to try and keep us practical, as I said, sometimes we spend 3 hours with someone collecting a story, and the mind can wander. One can start to think about other things. So one of the tips that I use to try and get my focus back on the person is to focus on their mouth, to actually look at the lips. What that does is it brings me back to the sound, the words, and then back to the immediate moment in the story. It's very simple, as you asked, but it works.
Wow. That's like 10 out of 10, the answer
Yeah.
to the question.
Okay. Cool.
Really, I never thought of it. It's so obvious. Man,
Yeah.
that's so good.
So I mean, sometimes you're sitting and it's hot, and maybe you need water, etc., but you don't want to break it. You don't want to break the session, and so it can get quite exhausting. And maybe we did, when we collected stories in one project, we were on the road for I think 7 days. So every day collecting 2 stories and driving in between, and going to get the different ambient sounds I spoke about. So it's quite a lot of work. So it can be quite tiring. So yeah, if you find your mind wandering off, just go back to the mouth, then the sound, and then the words, and then the meaning.
Wow. That is great. And it takes a lot of focus, and at the same time it's so easy. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Stuart, you've given me so many cases and advice. That has been a pleasure, honestly. And I would love this to last, but since it's like an interview, we have a formal end. But I have 2 questions that I ask all storytellers that I stumble upon on this show, and you're about to face them. So the first one is not about actually story collecting, it's about storytelling. So what would be your advice for people who want to be better at storytelling, but they are only beginning their way and starting to develop their skill?
Well, I think that, so 2 things. I think the School of Storytelling in Sussex offers these short courses like I did. It's just a weekend. And their teachers, if you get enough people interested, they'll come to your city. They go to Turkey, South Africa, all over the world. And that's a really good short introduction. That's low risk, and you can see, do I like this? Do I want to study more? If you do want to study more, then they've got 2-3 week courses in England where you do like, and they're kind of focused on things like autobiographical storytelling, folklore. So it's quite cool as well. The second thing is I would listen to the radio. So here in Africa, radio is still one of the best mediums of communication. It's cheap, it's easy, you don't need data. And when we run campaigns for our clients, especially the nonprofit clients, radio is still one of the best ways to reach people. Radio means that you can't see. So we're used to the world of internet, of YouTube, and we're always visual. And stories are about the spoken word. We need to practice your listening to be a good storyteller. And the best way to do that is to listen to radio. So, I mean, Artem, I think you're a bit younger than me, but I remember as a kid, you tune into the serial, the story on the radio. Today we've got podcasts. But you used to listen in, and there was an expectation and there was a delay. And in that delay, in that week, your mind would work over the plot and you think, what happens? What could possibly happen? And I think that's a really important part of our imagination, of our creativity, that perhaps we're missing, because now we've got everything on demand, right? Netflix, we could just download anything right away. There's no more waiting, which also means we're not processing the stories in our minds. But if you can get hold of something that is radio or podcast, and just delay gratification. Let your mind work into the story, and then you'll see, well, how do they tell the story? How do they deal with this issue? What is this character going to say? How's the plot going to change? That's a really good way of exercising your storytelling skills.
Wow. Again, it's like looking at lips, very practical, and at the same time,
Yeah.
really, really useful. Wow. Thank you so much.
This makes me think of those books where you could choose the story, you could choose the ending, and you'd read a story and then I'd say, okay,
Yeah.
choose this way or that way. I love that. And I think you can do the same with radio. Like, one of the reasons I think that I'm into stories is because as a kid growing up in South Africa, I didn't lack for anything, but I spent a lot of time in my imagination. We didn't have, obviously didn't have internet. TV didn't come here until I was in maybe grade 4, and it was really bad. So as a kid, I would need to use my imagination to think about things. And I think that's a gift that people today don't really have, because everything's instantly on demand, right? All the media is bombarding us.
And it really slows it down. The radio is slow. I drive a car and I always listen to a book or a podcast or radio if, I get sleepy or whatever. And yeah, the conversational part is like, oh yeah, that's next episode. Wow. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. All right. The last question, and obviously my favorite question, I've saved it for last. I want you to finish a phrase I made up. And it's about stories, obviously. Okay. The phrase goes like this. It takes one thing to get from a good story to a great story. And that one thing is?
It takes one thing to get from a good story to a great story. And that one thing is structure. Like I said earlier, there's a difference between an anecdote, a nice to have tale, and a story. A story is not just A to B. It's going like this. It's going to have mountains, valleys. It's going to have external influences. And that's the human condition, is one of change. I mean, if we've seen it this year, definitely. But if I want to hear a story about Artem, I don't want to hear just that, Artem got married, had a child, grew old, and they loved each other. There's nothing in that for me. I want to know what happened in that marriage of 20 years, 30 years. I want to know the conflicts, how they resolve the conflicts, how they changed, how they view marriage. So what makes for a great story is, actually, I changed my word, Artem. It's not structure. What makes for a great story is curiosity. Be curious about what's really there, what's not being said. What does Artem not say about his marriage? That will also give you clues to where to investigate, right? Listen for the silences. Watch where he doesn't want to speak. Watch where he speaks with a lot of enthusiasm. So these are all the clues that you can do to get you a full story. A story of texture is one where is around curiosity. And that's what really story collecting is about. It's being genuinely curious about this person, about the story, and being open to the fact the story might not be what we thought. Often our stories are not what they told us. Clients will say, this guy's got a great story. he's been at the company 20 years, it's progressed, and you get there and there's nothing there, or it's different from what they thought. So curiosity makes for the great story.
I love how you started answering this question as a storyteller and ended it as a story collector. That was beautiful. Thank you, Stuart. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show and talk more about story collecting. And it's really an art form. You've proved it right. And I like that even our conversation is feeling like something quiet and concerned, but very, very meaningful. So thanks so much. And as a a wrap up, can you share some contacts of yours for the folks around here to get in contact with you?
Sure. So they can reach me via email on stuart@rothcommunications.co.za. So that's STUART at ROTH communications.co.za. And our website is www.rothcommunications.co.za.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get this link into the description. And thank you once again. Have a greatest day ahead of you and a lot of stories to come.
Thanks, Artem.